I'm going to show you how to look up actions via the Orchestrator REST API. Let's get started. Hi everyone, I'm Watrous from VVork. If this is your first time here and you want to learn about automating, programming, and monitoring in VMware environments, you're in the right place. In the previous videos, we've been taking a look at how to use the Orchestrator REST API to do things with workflows. But the API is not limited to workflows by any stretch of the imagination. We can work with lots of different types of objects in Orchestrator. So let's take a look at how to work with actions using the same Orchestrator REST API. Let's head on over to the lab environment. As you can see, here are all the REST requests that we've been working with in the previous videos. These REST requests allowed us to do things with Orchestrator workflows. But let's put those aside because Orchestrator's REST API can do more than just work with workflows. There are a number of different types of objects within Orchestrator, and we can access them all through the same API. So what we're going to do next is turn our attention to these REST requests, which are going to allow us to work with the actions defined in Orchestrator. Now, to be clear here, I'm not talking about AVX actions or other types of actions. I'm talking specifically about actions in Orchestrator. So with that in mind, let's take a look at our first REST request, the one called get all actions. As you can see, the endpoint URL is pretty straightforward. The only variable we have here is the one that we're using to pass in our Orchestrator server. The rest of the endpoint URL is pretty straightforward. So VCO, API, actions. All of the actions in this category will begin with the URL that looks like that. So let's go ahead and send this request. And as you can see, we got back a 200 and we got back a bunch of stuff. Why don't we copy this and paste it on in Notepad++. All right, we'll type Control V to paste in the response body. Let's go to plugins, JSON tools. We'll open the tree viewer. And additionally, we're going to go to JSON tools and pretty this up. All right, and then one last thing, Alt-0 to collapse that over there on the left. We're going to take a look over here on the right to see what we got. So with this response body, we get back JSON, and as you can see, it contains at the high level two things. It's got an array called link, and in that array there are 615 different elements, which correspond to the 615 Orchestrator actions that I have in my Orchestrator server. Now, if we expand link, each of these items here, each of these elements is an action. For example, if I expand 0, we're seeing information about a specific action. But let's actually take a look at the same thing over here on the left side of the screen. We'll take a look at the very first action, and we'll expand so that we can see the whole thing. Give me a few moments here. Now let's take a look at what we have. So again, what you see here is information about a single action. What can we tell? We can tell the name of the action is log result. We can see that right here is where we would see a description if there was a description for this action, which there's apparently not. We can see the ID of the action. We can see the fully qualified name of the action. So the fully qualified name is the name of the action, which we saw up above, with the module name prepended. So here's our action module called com.vmware.library.snmp. So the FQDN is that whole name. We can see which version number of this action we're looking at. And additionally, we have a link here that you'll notice includes the action ID. This link, if we send it in a GET REST request, will give us information about this specific action. And it will give even more detailed information than what you see when you look up all the actions. Very similar to workflows. If you look up all the workflows or all the actions, you get information about all of them, but it's more of a high level view of what's going on with those. On the other hand, if you look up one workflow or one action, you get much more detailed information. All right, and then the last thing that we see here, this fella here called rel is letting us know that this is an action. Now, since we happen to be in here, why don't we go take a look at the very last action that I have in my environment. So scrolling down to the bottom, why don't we grab this scroll bar? Otherwise, we'll be here all day. So we scroll down, and if we take a look at the last action in my environment, again, give me a few moments here to expand this. Again, now we're looking at the last action, which is an action that I just defined a little bit earlier today. So I have an action called say hello, and you can see this action has a description associated with it. We can see the ID of the action. We can see its FQDN, not FQDN. That's similar, but what I meant to say was fully qualified name. It's not a domain name. And additionally, we can see the version. We've got the link to get more information about this specific action. And once again, rel equals action to remind us that this is an action that we're looking at. All right, if you want to, you can run this request yourself and look at the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of actions. But I think we can move along to some more interesting stuff here. In particular, let's take a look at the test tab. So in this REST request that I defined, the test tab is taking all of those, in my case, 615 actions, and what it's going to do is it's going to pick out two pieces of information. It's going to pull out, for the very first action, the name of the very first action and its ID. Now, the reason why I'm doing that in this particular REST request is because I want to set up a couple of variables to make subsequent REST calls a little more interesting. I could have made you set up those variables manually, but just by picking an action, in this case I'm picking the first one, we're getting the name and the ID of that action. All right, so how's that work? Well, in this code here, data link 0 is the first action, and then in this for loop, actually that's a while loop, in the while loop that you see me going through here, what we're doing with this I counter variable is we're going through each of the attributes of the very first action. Again, to see what I'm talking about here, if we go back and look at the very first action, the while loop with its I variable is taking a look at each of these attributes one at a time. And what it's looking for is an attribute called ID. If it sees an attribute called ID, it's going to save this ID in a variable. And same thing for the name. If it sees an attribute called name, it's going to save the name of this action. So that's what we're doing. And again, the way that happens is this loop goes through looking for those two attributes. And then once it's exited the loop, it's looked at all the attributes. It's got the two that we're looking for, and it's using pm.environment.set to save the action name that we, actually I should say save the action name that we looked up. We stored it in this variable. In this test code, the method that we're calling here, the set method, is setting up this postman variable. And similarly, this is the variable within this test code, and we're using pm.environment.set to put the action ID into the postman variable called action_ID. And again, we can do a lot of other requests provided we have, in particular, the action ID. Action name is nice, but action ID is what you really need. Very much like workflows. It's nice to know a workflow's name, but if you want to call the workflow, you need the workflow ID. If you want to call an action, you need the action ID. All right, so that's enough for this get all actions. What I want to do is take a look next at get one action. This is a very similar request that's going to zero in on one specific action. The way we tell it which action we're interested in is by passing in an action ID as one of the path parameters in our REST request, endpoint URL. So you know from our previous discussion that by running the previous REST request, we have already populated this postman variable called action_ID. Now, if we had wanted to, we could have manually copied and pasted the action ID from the response that we got in the previous request, but I intentionally put the action ID and action ID into this variable so that we could just simply come along and click on the send button. So when we send this request, as you can see, we get 200 series code. That's good. Notice this time we have far less data being returned to us, because even though we're getting more information about an action, we're only getting information about one action. Once again, let's copy this wonderful response body and take it on over to Notepad++. We'll open up a new tab. We'll paste it in. Let's do Control-Alt-Shift-J to update the tree browser, Control-Shift-P to pretty it up. And again, I always like to collapse the left side so that I can drill into it. Very similar to what I'm going to do over here in the JSON tree view. So on the JSON tree view, as you can see, we have more information than we did before when we were looking up all the actions. Now we're just looking up one action, but we've got more info. So what kind of info do we have? Well, again, we've got some sort of, oh, I recognize this URL. This is the URL that we just sent to get this information. This is the URL for this particular action. So notice it says blah, 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 action / and then the ID of the action that we're looking at. We'll take a look at relations here in a moment, but notice we can also see the ID of this action right here. We can see that that action has no return value. It's returning void as opposed to returning string or a properties object or an array of strings or a VC virtual machine. This particular action is returning nothing. The name of this action is called log result. The action module that it's stored in is com.vmware.library.snmp. We're using version 001. Here's the FQ in. Here's the actual script in that action. So if you wanted to, you could go to the Orchestrator client, look up this action and see the code there, but we can see the code without even going into the Orchestrator client. It's right there. What else do we have? Bundle has content. I have to confess, I don't really recall what that one's about. So insert made up answer here. Runtime memory limit and runtime timeout allow us, if we wanted to, in particular on polyglot modules, to specify a maximum amount of memory or a maximum amount of CPU cycles that our action can consume. Input parameters is sort of the opposite of output dash type. Input parameters allows us to feed information into this action when we call it. So what kind of inputs does this have? Well, looks like it has just one. And looks like what it wants here in this case is an array of properties objects. It's going to pass that in as an input called result. And it looks like the person that wrote this particular action didn't bother to type a description. All right, so that's most everything, but there's still these relations. So relations is an array called link, and it's got a bunch of things in it. Why don't we go over here where we can see it perhaps a little more easily. So where's relations hiding? There's relations. So relations, in this particular action, there are 3 entries. If we look at them, very similar to the relations that we've seen for workflows, these 3 entries in the links, the relation links array, these entries provide the URLs that we can use to do other things related to what we're doing right now. Right now, we're looking up one action. But if you wanted to, you could find out information about all the times this action has been run. So very similar to looking at workflow runs, you can look at action runs. We can look up the permissions on this action. And additionally, we can see here that the alternate relation gives us a URL that does the same thing as the URL that we just sent, but you'll notice that instead of ending in an action ID, this is ending in an FQN. So this URL that you see here and the one that we saw up above are doing this, would do the same thing. This is just an alternate way of doing the same thing. So again, what we've seen here in this video is primarily 2 things. One, how to look up all the actions. Again, when you do that, you get a good amount of information for every action. But what we just saw is that if you look up the information for a single action, you get even more info. Join me in the next video as we continue to explore the Orchestrator REST API.